the Syrian government has powerful friends. Here, the Russian and Chinese ambassadors at the UN are using their veto for the fourth time to protect Syria from the kind of delegitimization that was done to the Libyan government of Colonel Gaddafi. In my opinion, the governments of Russia and China have drawn a red line around Syria. And they have decided that Syria is not going to fall. They have learned their lesson from what happened in Libya, because they lost a lot. They lost a lot of contracts, investments, friends, when they were duped by NATO into going along with UN Resolution 1978 for the no-fly zone over Libya. And so they have resolved, in my opinion, that Syria cannot fall, because if it does, then it won't be long before the terrorist mercenaries are at the gates of Beirut and Baghdad and Tehran and soon Moscow and Beijing. So they have decided that Syria must stand. And they have powerful armies, military forces. Here's Russian military helicopters on attack against ISIS starting last September of 2015. And the Russian military offensive changed the game on the ground in Syria. They did more damage to ISIS and al-Nusra in 1 week than the U.S. military coalition had done in a year and a half. Another asset that the Syrian government has is a reconciliation movement. And this is Mother Agnes Mariam of the Cross of Homs. We had her tour in Canada and the United States a while ago. She is promoting peaceful reconciliation inside of Syria. I'll talk about that later. We also have, the Syrian government also has international solidarity with real leftists, people from Central and South America who understand imperialism, unlike some of our colleagues and alleged comrades here in North America and Europe. And it has the support of people in the anti-war movement, such as the Syrian Solidarity Movement, of which I'm an executive member. Oops. And finally, and not to be underestimated, the Syrian people and government have a credible leader who is associated very strongly with the idea of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And he is, as I said before, the most popular person in Syria. And that's not just because of a poll that was taken by a Western polling firm, but the elections that took place under the new constitution in June 2014 for president. The first multi-party elections in half a century, in which there was an impressive 78% turnout. Our recent Canadian election had 58%. And of the 78% who voted, 87% supported Bashar al-Assad. And was it a fair election? You bet. There was an election observer team from over 30 countries around the world. So, thanks to the resistance of the Syrian people and their allies, such as President Putin here, who's standing before a map of Crimea, which is now part of Russia again, we now have the beginnings of a multipolar world again. The United States no longer has free sway over all the events that are taking place in the world. So, that's the big picture. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the Second International Tour of Peace to Syria, on which I was a participant about 2 months ago. And in this picture, there's me, Canadian, and 2 Americans, 2 Norwegians, 1 Jordanian, and 1 Palestinian. The next tour of peace is going in September, and you are all invited to join. I'll talk about that later. Because of the Russian and Iranian military and diplomatic offensives last fall, that forced the United States and the Western powers back to the bargaining table in Geneva and kick-started the UN-sponsored Syrian peace process once again. Resolution 2254, I think it was December last year, 15th, said that there was going to be a new peace conference at which there were no preconditions. In other words, the Syrian government could participate as a full partner, and there was a roadmap which would lead to a transitional government and new elections in 18 months. And so, in February 27th, as a result of the negotiations, Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry and Mr. de Mistura announced that there was a partial cessation of hostilities to take place in Syria, excluding ISIS and al-Nusra. And the day after that, the Syrian government went ahead and called for Syrian parliamentary elections. They said it was an exercise in national sovereignty. This was a defiant act because nobody sitting at this table, and you in the picture, authorized the Syrian government to hold parliamentary elections. There was nothing in the peace agreement that they could hold parliamentary elections. There was supposed to be a peace process, a transitional government, and then elections. But the Syrian government defiantly, that's why I call the pamphlet Defiant Syria, went ahead and said, well, we are a sovereign country. We have a constitution, a new constitution we wrote in February 2012, the multi-party elections, a reformed constitution. We had an election in 2012. The Constitution says we have to have an election every 4 years. It's 2016. We're going to have an election.
Good for them.
So when we arrived in Damascus, the very next morning, we went to it. We had an audience with Gregorius III, the patriarch of the Greek Melkite Catholic Church, and the spiritual leader of millions of Catholics around the world. The patriarch told us that the Assyrian election, he supported the Syrian elections. He called them a challenge to the world. And he said that other countries should follow suit here who are faced with the meddling of foreign countries in their internal affairs, and they should exert their own sovereignty and never mind what the rest of the world thinks. And just to make his point, he led a procession through the old city, which we were invited to join, and he went to the Armenian Patriarch's church, which is on the right there, and next to the church is a school, and in the school was a polling station, and there's Gregorius III. On his left is the Armenian Patriarch, and he put his ballot into the ballot box, Gregorius declared that Syria, there's one people, one country. What does an election look like? That's the main reason we were there. So I'm going to tell you what a Syrian parliamentary election looks like. When we came out on the street, on every single street corner, there were groups of three, four young people, handsome young people, dressed in the colors of the parties or the candidates that they were representing. And they were handing out these quarter-page flyers, which were the lists of the slate that they endorsed, or the candidate that they endorsed. It looked to me very much like it felt to me very much like a union convention, a national union convention in Canada, where you have the establishment slate and the oppositional slate, and the people are handing out the slate lists at the door as you're going into the convention hall. There were election posters everywhere. It was a very hotly contested election. For 250 seats, there were 10,000 candidates. That's 40 candidates for every seat. But after a while, many of them dropped out. So by the end of by election day, there were only 3,000 candidates for 250 seats, 12 per seat on the average. Many of the candidates were women. And there were banners stretched across the narrow cobblestone streets of old Damascus. So we went up and down the streets of old Damascus. There's only 7 of us, but we stopped people in the street. We stopped people as they're going into the polling stations. We stopped people as they were coming out. We went into the polling stations to observe the process. And this is how the slate lists work their magic in Damascus. So here is a voter. He has to be 18 years old, and he has to have no record of working with the armed terrorists. Other than that, he can vote. He goes in, he shows his ID, his name is recorded, he gets an envelope and a ballot. And there are 29 spaces on the ballot. He can vote for all, he can fill all 29, he can just fill one. But if he doesn't, if he goes behind the curtain there and he decides he doesn't want to write in all 29 names, he can take the slate list that was handed to him on the street corner in the morning, just a little before, and he can put it instead into the envelope, seal the envelope, put it in the ballot box. Easy. But of course, they also make it such that if you don't like everybody on the one slate list, say you don't like Joe Blow and Jane Doe, you can cross out their names and then put it in the envelope, put it in the box. And also, if you happen to think that instead of Jane Doe and Joe Blow, you like John Smith and Margaret Brown, you can cross out the names of the people you don't like, put in the names you do like, put it in the envelope, stuff it in the ballot box, and now you can see why it takes 3 or 4 days to count all the ballots.
That's all.
So, the Syrian parliamentary election, there were nearly 9 million eligible voters, 5 million votes cast. The polls were so busy in Damascus they had to stay open until 11 o'clock at night. There was a 58% participation rate, same as in our last Canadian federal election. 140,000 refugees returned from Lebanon in one day just to vote. And let me tell you, it's not an easy thing like crossing at Fort Erie to cross the border back and forth. So 250 members of the People's Assembly were elected. 170 of them are from the Ba'ath Party and its allied political parties called the National Progressive Front, and 80 were oppositional candidates. So a friend of mine, when I sent him the pamphlet, said, well, obviously the Syrian elections are not democratic like ours in Canada, because it's predetermined that the governing party and its allies are going to win. And I had to respond to him by saying, well, what was the percentage of people in Canada that voted for Stephen Harper? 39.2%. How many voted for Trudeau? 39%. More people voted against Trudeau than for him, and yet he is our Prime Minister. In the 150 years since Confederation, how many parties have formed a government in Canada? 2. The Liberals and the Conservatives. They're Tweedledum and Tweedledee, Democrats and Republicans. If you look in the Parliament of Canada, can you find one parliamentarian out of 318 who will speak up for Palestine? One who is opposed to Canada belonging to NATO? One who is opposed to the capitalist system? I think you'd be hard-pressed. So, is the Canadian parliamentary system more democratic than the Syrian? I don't think so. I think the Syrians have a very good parliamentary system, and they have a very fair election. I think the elections probably represent the will of the Syrian people. And there were some interesting candidates elected. This is Nora Arisian. She's an Armenian by ethnicity, and I got to know her very briefly while marching with the Patriarch. She was there, and she came up to me because she knew I was Canadian, and she said to me, I want to thank you, I want to thank Canada for bringing in 25,000 refugees. And then she added, but we want them to come back as soon as possible. She was an opposition candidate. There's another interesting opposition candidate. Her name is Noor al-Shodri. Her brother Yahya was a Syrian soldier captured by ISIS near Raqqa a few years ago. And they held a gun to his head and said, we want you to say, long live the caliphate. And instead of saying, long live the caliphate, he defiantly said, it will be erased. They executed him on the spot. A violation of the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners, and they not only did that, they recorded it. You can watch it on YouTube if you can stomach it, and they brazenly put it on YouTube. So his sister Noor easily won her seat. She was also an opposition candidate.
For what group?
I really don't know. Now here's the key point. There are no elections in the rebel-held areas. There are the terrorist mercenaries who operate in those areas have two reasons. One is they fundamentally disagree with the idea of elections. They consider it to be idolatry. It's the deviant form of Islam known as Wahhabism that comes from Saudi Arabia, where they also don't have elections. The other reason is that if the terrorist mercenaries who occupy whole chunks of Syria held elections, they know very well that they would lose, that the people would vote for the Syrian government. And they have said that on many occasions, that among the people they hold hostage and as human shields in the occupied areas, in a moment will go over to the government of Bashar al-Assad. So, how do the people in those areas, how have they voted in the past? They vote with their feet. Most of the people in those areas have fled. They've gone most of them have gone to become internally displaced people. They have swelled the population of Damascus twice. They've doubled it. Latakia, I think, is 3 times the normal population. And some have fled to the west. So the people in the rebel-held areas have also voted, but not with their hands, with their feet instead. We were lucky also to have an audience with Ali Haider, the Syrian Minister of Reconciliation. He is a leader of the wing of the opposition party. Even though he's a minister of the government, he is not a member of the Ba'ath Party or its allied parties. In fact, he is a leader of a wing of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. He is not an Alawite like Bashar al-Assad. He is an Ismaili, which is a branch of Islam. Like the president, he is an ophthalmologist by profession, a very educated man. He would be what we would call part of the loyal opposition in Canada. Yet, his son was targeted by the mercenaries, and they jailed him to his home in Hula, and they killed his son in cold blood. According to Minister Haider, the purpose of reconciliation is to save Syrian lives, to shorten the war, and to lead to an inclusive post-war pluralist Syrian society. Because of the terrorist mercenaries operating in Syria, they have fanned a lot of sectarian flames, and they've torn the pluralistic fabric of Syrian society. And part of the reconciliation is to repair that torn fabric of pluralism and diversity. And so what does a reconciliation project look like? Well, they've had, according to Minister Haider, up till September of last year when the Russian and Iranian offensive started, there were 50 projects that had been completed. The most famous one was getting rid of the last 1,000 of the terrorist mercenaries from Homs without firing a shot. So the Syrian government, these are the deals that they offer to the Syrian rebels, the Syrian mercenaries among these terrorist organizations, not the foreign fighters, the Syrians. The Syrian government will provide safe passage out of a rebel-held area for those fighters who aren't interested in laying down their arms and receiving amnesty. For those Syrian fighters who lay down their arms and accept amnesty, the committee promises that security records will be cleared and jobs will be found. For those who wish to remain in arms, they are invited to join the Syrian Arab Army and can even form their own units. 800 former Syrian mercenaries switched sides and joined the Syrian Arab Army in Latakia province alone. President Assad granted blanket amnesties 8 times in the last 5 years for a total of about 20,000 former Syrian mercenaries. So this is the way that they are shortening the war, preventing deaths in the Syrian army and needless civilian deaths. He also continued on the question of refugees, and this is what he had to say. He said the Syrian government was not to blame for the refugee crisis. The refugees are the inevitable consequence of the war of aggression against Syria. Neighboring countries deliberately inflate figures of refugees for their own interests and refuse all requests from Syria to repatriate the refugees. He was talking about Jordan and Turkey. Syria desperately needs the refugees to return for the reconstruction process. Refugees, the ones that have ended up on the shores of southern Europe, are mainly young and highly trained at the expense of the Syrian government. The Syrian state has managed to feed, clothe, and school all the internally displaced people, even though some Syrian cities have doubled or tripled in population. And these are the incentives for refugees to return. The Syrian government personnel on the affected borders prioritize repatriating external refugees even if they have lost all their documents. Temporary documents are issued on the spot. If refugees have security problems, efforts are made to clear personal records expeditiously. If the external refugees owned homes, they get these homes back. If not, they are provided shelter for free in resettlement centers. Many public statements offering amnesty have been made by President Assad, including a promise that opposition supporters who return will be guaranteed the right to work with the unarmed Syrian internal opposition. And as we were leaving Premier Minister Haider's office, in walked 5 members of the delegation that was going to Geneva the very next day. And of the 5, these were all members of the internal opposition in Syria who were part of the Syrian delegation at Geneva. 2 of them were former members of the who were formerly armed mercenaries who had been pardoned, and they had been allowed to come back. They had been allowed to join the loyal opposition or the domestic opposition, and then they became part of that delegation at Geneva. So it's amazing what they're able to do. And the very next day, of course, the peace talks opened in Geneva, and the Syrian delegation, as a result of the election, the parliamentary election in which they received a mandate. You have to, I would say that the election in Syria, the parliamentary election, could be understood as something like a strike vote in a union. The Syrian government was going to be going to Geneva. They wanted a fresh mandate from the people. They called an election. They got the mandate. They went to Geneva. So that was the purpose in the end, or that was the practical purpose of those parliamentary elections. I don't think I have time to talk about Yarmouk. This is a very famous picture of the former refugee camp and neighborhood of Damascus that has been destroyed by the occupation by these foreign-backed terrorist mercenaries. And the Palestinians have now been turned, in Syria, have often now been turned into refugees for a second time. If somebody wants to ask a question in the Q&A, please feel free. The last place we visited on our tour was Palmyra, the bride of the desert. And in the year 2015, about a year ago, convoys like this, full of ISIS mercenaries, traveled across the desert, open convoys, broad daylight. One convoy came all the way from Iraq, one came from Raqqa, and a third came from the province, the outskirts of the province of Homs. And the US-led coalition did not fire a single shot. They did not drop a single bomb on them. Why? Well, it's because ISIS is useful to the US government and to the Western countries in NATO. It's an asset. And as long as the ISIS is attacking Syrian government forces, they will not be bombed or attacked by the USA. However, if they step on the US toes by attacking the Kurdish Peshmerga in the north of Iraq, where the United States is grooming a separatist government, a separatist Kurdish state, then they will receive the full force of the US-led coalition. So these ISIS head choppers came to Palmyra unopposed, and they took Palmyra in 2015, and 200 Syrian Arab army soldiers were killed. These barbarians partially destroyed the World Heritage Site, That was this is Antoine, our cultural guide, standing in front of the ruins of the Temple of Baal, and with a picture of what it looked like before it was dynamited by the barbarians. They also destroyed another temple and the Arch of Triumph. In front of the museum, which fortunately the Syrian government had emptied before the attack and put all its treasures were put in safe storage, except the big ones outside the museum, which they were unable to move. To these, the ISIS mercenaries took sledgehammers, knocked them over, and smashed them. These are part of the cultural heritage of the entire human race that they were attacking. And they also killed they beheaded the curator of the museum, an 82-year-old man, and put his head on one of those posts out there. We were traveling through the new town of Podmore, which is beside the ancient Roman site, where there was a lot of damage. We happened to be there on the day that the Syrian army and the Russian army, the Russian forces, allowed the citizens of Todmor to return to the ruins of their homes and to sort through the rubble and bring all of their pots and pans and pillows and carpets and vacuum cleaners out onto the street where there were buses and trucks waiting to take them away. And we were filled with, the members of the delegation were overwhelmed with pity for these people. As usual, we underestimated the Syrians. And we went up to this particular family, and many of the people in the delegation could speak fluent Arabic, and engaged the patriarch of this family, an old man. And he looked up from the sorting through all their belongings on the street, and we asked, our delegate member said, "Well, how are you doing? How are you coping with all this?" And the man said, "We are doing great. Now that the jihadist mercenaries have been driven out of, now that ISIS has been driven out of Tadmor, life is going to be so much better. And as for the destruction of the town, we're going to rebuild it. It'll be twice as good as before." That was the typical kind of resilience that we were often surprised, because I went to Syria with a complete misapprehension of what the Syrian people would be like. I thought after 5.5 years of war and devastation, they would be depressed, downcast, defeatist, pessimistic. But instead, like this old man, they were resilient and defiant and optimistic. And while we were there, at the end of the day, we all had to get out fast, because the Russian sappers had found some more mines and some more booby traps, and all of a sudden there was boom, 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 as they exploded them, and you could see the smoke coming, rising in clouds from behind the Roman columns. This is a famous picture that probably most of you have seen. This is part of the victory celebration for the liberation of Palmyra. And the most unusual thing, in the center there is a complete symphony orchestra flown in from Russia. And they played a concert for Syrian army soldiers in the Roman amphitheater, which fortunately ISIS did not destroy, in Palmyra. And they were playing a concert called Praying for Palmyra. And I started off with George Bush. I remember George Bush and his neocons were saying it was a clash of civilizations. Actually, I don't think that was quite right. I think it's a clash of civilization versus barbarism. And in this clash, the Syrian government, the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, their Palestinian allies, their Iraqi allies, represent the forces of civilization. Whereas the Americans, NATO, the head choppers, Saudi Arabians, represent the forces of barbarism. So this was a great victory, in my opinion, of civilization over barbarism. I'm going to end up by saying a few things about Canadian foreign policy, because that's my job as an anti-war activist. It'll only be a couple more minutes, I hope. You may remember that part of the demands of the anti-war movement was to remove Canadian fighter jets from the US-led coalition, and that was part of the campaign promises of Justin Trudeau. It took him 6 long months to do that, and we were disappointed when he removed these planes and left in Canadian refuelers, transport, and reconnaissance planes. So the Canadian government is no longer actually participating in the bombing of Syria and Iraq. We are merely, it's similar to driving the getaway car and not actually robbing the teller in the bank. We are accomplices to a war, to an illegal act of war, because unlike the Russians, the Iranians, the Hezbollah, who have the permission of the Syrian government to operate inside of Syria, the Americans, the Canadians, the British, the French, and all the other usual suspects, neo-colonial suspects, are in complete violation of international law by operating in that manner. And what did Justin Trudeau do instead? He tripled the number of Canadian trainers in the separatist state of Kurdish state in northern Iraq. Here are Canadian soldiers wearing the Kurdish flag on their as shoulder patches. That's how bad it is. This is a direct violation, direct contradiction to stated Canadian foreign policy on Iraq, which is that we, as Canada, support the territorial integrity of Iraq. We don't want to split up into 3 countries.
No.
But here we are, working for the splitting up of that country. Here's a to-do list for Justin Trudeau. Form a fact-finding mission of parliamentarians, journalists, academics, just as the French and the EU did recently, and send it to Syria. Normalize diplomatic relations between Canada and Syria. Lift Canadian economic sanctions against Syria. Quit the so-called Friends of Syria group of countries. Leave the US-led coalition in Syria and Iraq. Make a clean break from the Harper-era policy of using taxpayers' dollars to fund various terrorist outfits inside of Syria. Terminate the Saudi arms sale. You have on your seat is a postcard. If you put your name in the corner there, you don't need a stamp to mail it. Justin Trudeau will write you a letter trying to justify why he's selling arms to Saudi Arabia. We should quit NATO and develop an independent Canadian foreign policy. That's our wish list, or our to-do list for Justin Trudeau. Why is it important? Because in the Middle East, there are so many players involved that it could easily flare up into a big regional war or even a world war. It reminds me a lot of August 1914 right now. And so, the best thing we can do to prevent that regional war and that world war is to help Syria repel the illegal invasion that's been waged by the West against it. So I'd like to finish by saying, long live Syria.